Hello everybody, I'm Richard Tonry. I'm a firmware security architect and distinguished engineer at Dell.
Hi, and I'm Mohit Arora. I am a software security architect and a senior distinguished engineer at Dell. And we're here to present our talk, Got Supply Pain, a real world approach to supply chain SDL, or Secure Development Lifecycle.
And then just a show of hands, how many of you guys seen our previous SDL talk?
I know I have. Oh, there's
Great.
two.
You got a couple? Awesome.
Got another one.
Yeah, it's not a prerequisite, but we're going to be talking a little bit, we're going to be expanding a bit on that topic here. So first, the legal stuff.
Easy.
Done?
Done.
And so we've always heard that it's good to start a presentation with some kind of story or anecdote or
Rhetorical questions for us.
Right.
Get to
or,
the point.
Yeah. So we have a series of rhetorical questions for you guys. Admittedly, these are not really rhetorical, but we're going to go with it anyways.
Yep.
So we're all coming to you from engineering, and this is from the engineering perspective. We were in the trenches when we were doing this SDL stuff. We lived through this, and so what we're sharing with you comes from a practical perspective and dealing with these kind of problems. So first rhetorical question: where's your supplier's threat model, right? And then our response as engineers, a few years ago, really more like a decade ago, was like, I don't know.
Yep. And then, we all matured, right? And we rolled out SDL within our companies, and we started asking more mature questions, like to our suppliers, where's your threat model? And we still got the same response, like, I don't know, what's going on?
Yeah, and then how many of you have asked your suppliers for their penetration testing, and then what response did you get? Like, I don't know.
And then, you kind of backed up, and said, do you have any SDL artifacts you can share at all with us? And, we were still getting the response and a whole bunch of emojis like this.
Yeah.
Like, I'm not sure what you want.
Start responding to us with emojis, you're triggering.
You're in trouble.
So how many of y'all have asked about their SDL processes, and what was their response? At this point, right, we're getting a little frazzled, and they start bringing in the lawyers.
Yeah, quickly.
Yeah, and so this is the conclusion of our rhetorical question section of the talk. Hopefully what we're going to be covering today will help answer some of these questions. We just want to make a note about this AI-generated image. We asked it to generate a room with lawyers, one side of the room concerned lawyers, the other confused lawyers. And this is kind of the freak show that it provided. So
we had to go with it.
We had to go with it.
So before we start, let's walk through our objectives for today. What we want to talk about. We want to talk about how to expand the secure development lifecycle across your suppliers, and for us, actually across the full technology stack, hardware all the way to the cloud. And then second, we want to talk about how to operationalize and actually execute a supplier-based SDL while staying in line with the industry standards and best practices. And then we'll close with some key takeaways, next steps, and how to apply this to your organization.
And so this talk is an extension of our previous talk here at RSA, One SDL to Rule the World from Hardware to the Cloud. We'll be expanding on this, but we're going to be expanding it to the supply chain across the full stack. Here's a QR code, Of course, if you see a QR code on the slide, you're supposed to click on it,
You could trust us.
We're all security people here, right? Trust but verify.
So as Richard said, that previous talk, we actually introduced this concept of full stack SDL. So we want to give you a primer on that really quickly. At Dell, and like most of us, we build software applications, but we also have OS and drivers, we have hardware and firmware, and of course, cloud applications. And we actually have solutions that span in one solution all these technology layers. So for us, it was, a goal to extend SDL across all the technology layers and make sure it was comprehended. And that's where this concept of full stack SDL comes from. I know many of y'all may have aspects of these technology layers or all of them, but for us it was important to cover everything from the start. And so with that, now we are taking into consideration our suppliers, right? So now how do we expand all of this, the concept of full stack SDL across our suppliers SDL, And that's really the motivation for the talk today, give you an overview of how we did that and the work we did at Dell to enable that.
Yep. So as Mohit said, a full stack SDL includes the hardware, firmware, software, cloud layers. Your threat model really depends on where you are in the stack. And then, as you said, now we're going to expand it to the suppliers. But we're going to actually start with a non-technical example of threat modeling something like pigs flying.
Nice.
And this is actually a carryover from our previous talk. But we're going to use it as an example here, and this time focusing on the supplier aspects. So, what do we traditionally think of when we think about pigs flying? Right, we think about the classic example here, right? But there's other examples. A pilot is a pig is a pilot flying a sophisticated piece of machinery, a commercial airliner. How about a pig as a passenger, right? Kind of like me flying over here to get to San Francisco. So let's dig into these a little bit from a supplier standpoint.
Yeah, let's look at the first classical flying pig example and what kind of supply chain-based threats or concerns this pig may have. So if it's actually flying, it may run into bad weather, and if it has, third-party supplier-based weather equipment that's malfunctioning, that could be a concern. If it has ground cameras doing surveillance, and that's from a supplier that's malfunctioning, another concern to worry about. Communication services, if there's hunters or hunting notices coming out, and they're not getting them because it's a third-party comm service, another issue. Obviously, I'm not going to state the obvious here. Physical security is going to be a huge concern for this pig.
Yeah. And then we have the pig as a passenger. The food supply is a real concern. The food choice here is a real concern, especially if you might be one of the food choices. Passenger screening from a supply chain standpoint, some passengers may view you as a food choice.
I'd be concerned.
Me too. It almost feels like that sometimes as it is.
Yep. And then you got the other pig flying example. The pig as the pilot flying this very complex piece of machinery through the air. And obviously, airplanes aren't really designed today to support pilot pigs flying. Hosts don't really grab these controls. Maybe that's more of a requirements discussion, not security yet. We'll get to that a little later.
So obviously, supply chain is important here from a product standpoint. We're going to use the pig as a pilot here as an example to dig in deeper to that supply chain aspect. And obviously the aircraft itself. So examples of threats here could include the controls and switches. This is hardware, maybe firmware. Avionics and instruments could approach your firmware layer. The flight controls could be software and hardware, right? Then you have your communications, your headsets, antennas. These are all part of your cloud communications. And really what this represents, is the overall aircraft. It's the full stack, right?
Yep.
The piece of machinery represents components from all different layers, and that's what we mean by full stack from a supplier SDL and threat model perspective. So the aircraft is a product. It's made of many components and from many different suppliers, each with its own threats and each with its own threat model. We understand this was kind of a fun example. This is just us really getting started and try to entertain you guys a little bit. But hopefully it illustrates what we mean by full stack and full stack from a supplier and SDL standpoint, because we're going to be digging more into that here next.
One thing we want to address first is, before we go into supply chain SDL, just SDL within the organization. Do you have SDL? You got an SDL?
I got SDL.
We got SDL. So we want to do a quick recap on just an example SDL process and what that looks like. We're going to use our approach at Dell and what we've done. For us, it starts with the high-level SDL policy, right? And that policy spans in its scope hardware to cloud and every technology layer within it. That policy actually points to a set of comprehensive SDL controls that have multiple activities that need to be completed, from design, verification, governance, and a lot of these controls, and we have about maybe over 60 now, are aligned to industry standards, the NIST SSDF, OWASP. For hardware, we use CWE for weaknesses. And so far, nothing's tied to the different technology layers. But when we click into the individual controls, right, they have their own sections that have scope, applicability, requirements. This is where we can start delineating the different technology layers and the requirements to those. And so we did that by basically taking each of these controls and looking at which ones were applicable to hardware, firmware, different technology layers. So as an example, power analysis is an attack that we have as a control that's really only focused on hardware. So we scope it to that. Taking our threat model example, right, that one spans across all these layers. So that control will apply to all the technology layers. In addition to the different technology layers, we also have maturity levels built into the SDL control catalog at Dell. And this basically helps you align different levels of maturity investment you want to do for SDL tied to your technology layers. For example, you may want to target level 1 SDL maturity, for hardware controls, maybe level 2 for software, level 3 for cloud, or whatever it makes sense for your organization's risk profile. again, went very quickly in a nutshell, wanted to share what Dell does from an SDL perspective internally, and so we can build on that earlier. Also, that QR code that you saw earlier, that goes into a lot of detail. So our presentation before was how we rolled this out within our company at Dell.
So now we're going to discuss how to expand SDL and that full stack SDL to suppliers. And then these are suppliers that provide us with components that we put into our products. And with that, we're also going to cover some of the learnings and pain points that came with that, and stuff that we've learned from the supply chain SDL perspective. So, and we understand that the supply chain security has many aspects. We're going to touch on things that we're not going to talk about here.
Yeah, and these things could probably be their own talks, so we don't have time to go through all of this.
Yeah, so infrastructure security, right? How does a supplier protect their own on-prem and cloud infrastructures? Information security, how does the supplier protect and secure their internal systems? And these are systems that they'll use to develop components that they deliver to us. Physical security, and how do you protect labs, offices, card readers, et cetera. You don't want these flying pigs bypassing your card readers.
Those flying pig threats don't stop.
Yeah, I know. So our focus will be on the SDL aspect, and with that, we want to get into how we're going to be expanding SDL into the supply chain. Yep. So let's look at how we matured from SDL to full stack SDL to supply chain integration of SDL as an extension of our organization's SDL.
Lots of SDL.
Yeah, I know, and apparently there's some kind of game or something. You're supposed to take a beverage every time you hear the word SDL, so you guys in the audience, you're welcome to play along. So as we mentioned, we're engineers, right? We're not supply chain experts or apparently comedians, because you guys didn't laugh at that one. We're not lawyers or in procurement, right? We're in engineering, so these learnings actually came to us from a practical perspective. And we are consumers of the supply chain components. When we design our products as engineers, we don't have full visibility of the supplier's threats or threat model, right, of the components that we integrate into our products. So we learned that there's a need for the supply chain SDL to make sure these threats are addressed to our standards, and especially as we consume these third-party components. So let's take a look at full stack SDL from a design implementation perspective. And this is how we described full stack SDL in our previous talk. Let's assume that the design is a product that spans the full stack. And for Dell, for most of our products, they do span the full stack, right, from the hardware all the way to the cloud. So what this means is that we have elements in the firmware layer, hardware layer, OS driver, software, and the cloud. The design begins at the far left in our technology incubation phase. We perform threat modeling at the architecture level very early in the design, and this is especially important that we understand these threats for these long lead time items such as hardware, because the hardware components, these chips that we use, they can take 2 to 3 years to develop, and by the time we get them, right? So it's really important that we understand where those threats are. And then we transfer those SDL artifacts at that architecture phase to different layers in the stack as they're developed. And this way that as we work on the design, we understand where the threats are, especially from like these longer lead time items and the hardware and firmware. And then we can mitigate these threats as we discover them in different layers. And if we find an unmitigated vulnerability in one area, we can potentially mitigate those on another layer of the stack. Now we want to actually shift it left further to the supply chain. And we do this by creating requirements for our suppliers, and then the suppliers, it's not working that well. And then the suppliers actually provide back the SDL attestations, or preferably the SDL artifacts, and then shifting our SDL to mitigate these threats even further left. Now, this can be significant. In worst case scenario, an issue with the hardware may lead to the R word, right?
Recall, if you didn't get it.
Yeah, our executives don't like that word, so it's the word of which we do not speak. So, but you might not actually be able to fix vulnerabilities in a layer that you can't mitigate after you ship the product. So that's where we're really concerned.
So next we want to walk you through at a high level kind of the end-to-end view of supply chain SDL before we get into the details. It all starts with those requirements Richard was saying, right? Shifting those left across hardware, firmware, all the way to the cloud. And this is when we say your threat model becomes my threat model. This is where it starts becoming a reality. In order to accomplish that, obviously, once we send those requirements to suppliers, they actually have to agree to them, right? This is where contracts and procurement come in, and that's a key piece of this. The suppliers should also, align, the supplier requirements that you give them should align to your internal requirements, and make sure you keep the same security posture that you have for yourself that you give to your suppliers. And it also gives you some consistency kind of end to end when you integrate those components. Once the suppliers provide their attestations, right, this is basically, some kind of feedback form, right, where they provide if they completed SDL, if not, how much did they do, some way for us to measure if SDL was completed to components as they're delivered to us, more than just a thumbs up in an email, right? You don't want just something that you can't legally stand by, right?
Yeah.
So at least we can say, did you do it? And they can come back and say, yes, we did, right? And here's our report for that. And then the final aspect here is going to be talking about how to integrate all this end-to-end, supply chain SDL into your existing SDL process. Because at the end of the day, you want to receive components, but also the attestations with them and be able to verify those and make sure they meet your expectations. So then hopefully at the end of the day, when you do have all this in place and you ask your vendor and supplier for SDL, they don't go and act like this and they give you something tangible.
So rolling this out, these are things that you'll face. So these are some of the major pain points that we discovered, and we're going to cover these. Like this includes like the complexity of having to figure out where the requirements go, right? Are they in procurement, contract, statement of work, the complexity of scale, dealing with hundreds or maybe even thousands of suppliers, the pain points of dealing with hundreds of product teams across the technology stack. And so we'll go into detail on how to handle the requirements and then the complexity. We do want to caveat this. So, suppliers may not be willing to sign up to contract requirements. Right? The size of the organization versus the supplier's willingness to agree to these requirements, it's potentially directly proportional to the organization's purchasing power. So one outcome that we see is cost-sensitive suppliers will agree to the requirements, but they'll increase the cost of the component. Another outcome could be a supplier's redlining contracts that could reduce the SDL effectiveness. So this should be part of your process to have the right teams, including security, product owners, legal, procurement, review any of these red lines that, that change SDL or potentially diminish the effectiveness of the SDL requirements. And at the end of the day, we have business risk assessments to decide if the business is willing to accept the risk or, deny it. And possibly move to another supplier when you can't get what you want, or what you need from your supplier. Vote with your dollars.
Right.
It's not working great.
Oops. So let's talk about shifting SDL further left in the supply chain a bit.
Right. Or lefter.
Lefter. Right.
Yeah, left.
Left. I think. Okay, this is a good joke. Shifting left, as we talked about, should include passing those requirements, getting those attestations back. But one thing we want to look forward to and think about doing as a community, is going beyond just attestation. We want to talk about, getting actual SDL artifacts back. This is, taking our threat model example. The artifact would be the actual threat model. Can we get that with the component so we can merge it with our, products threat model and really do that trust but verify, right, with the artifact in hand. And this could be done with different artifacts in SDL, right? That's a goal that we want to talk about, and discuss as an industry that we should start targeting.
And then you want to align on industry standards. So internally, we implemented the full stack standard. One of our goals from our previous talk is for the adoption of this full stack approach across the industry. So shifting SDL left is not really dependent on that full stack framework, but it helps. And however, all this is really possible because we align, and we should align on industry standard SDL frameworks such as SafeCode, NIST, et cetera. And adoption of these industry frameworks from a full stack approach allows us to be consistent in our SDL approach, and it's also enabling everyone to share artifacts and benefit from that common framework.
And then third, we may, wonder why we want to go just beyond attestation. I think some of the points are obvious, but sometimes having the attestation form is probably enough, depending on your supplier relationship and the products that you're looking at. But if you do have more complex technology stacks like we do at Dell, the impact to the product, the risk to our customers, we really need more than just attestations. So what we've done at Dell in certain cases, and one-off cases where we had these complex products with suppliers, we actually work with them to do kind of a combined sit-down SDL process, including threat modeling and other exercises together to really mitigate the risk of the product end to end. So we've actually started going beyond just attestations at Dell and working together on these artifacts and doing the STL together. And that's really important. We've noticed that that helps actually the vendor as well, where then, in future components that they deliver to us or new designs, they actually are building that security in already instead of having to, wait for us to ask for it. And that was kind of our goal to begin with, right? Since we're aligning to the industry, like Richard was saying, it helps, the vendors also see this as something that they can mature to, right, and invest in, and then it helps them across all their components, even with other customers, and they get a better ROI on their STL investment that they're doing.
Mm-hmm. So this needs to account for potential suppliers' concerns with sharing their artifacts with downstream partners. Even if it's under NDA, we need to approach this as though we're stronger together. And I know that's kind of cheesy, but let's go with it. And it is a real concern. We need to mitigate that fear. Our experience with suppliers and their willingness to work with us on STL, it varies. Yep. And there's perception that they have that exposing their STL artifacts and risk could expose their IP or the potential of their exposing their intellectual property. We have to recognize that and balance that with what works for the suppliers and the organizations. Attestation-based STL, that might work for your needs, right? But without knowing where the threats are, with the supplier's components, we really don't know where we can further mitigate the weaknesses to ensure that our products are as secure as they can be. And one of our goals here at RSA is to encourage us to actually start opening up discussions with our suppliers and then start working with them to break down these barriers and then mitigate that fear so we can get these artifacts. Yep. So this, ladies and gentlemen, is what we call a transition slide. So now we're going to talk about how we implemented supply chain STL.
Thanks, Richard.
Sure.
So just a high-level overview of the process that we used to implement supply chain STL first. We started by creating and defining our supplier security standards and the attestation forms that we talked about, so we'll get into that. Then, we needed to prioritize. Like Richard said, we have thousands of suppliers and thousands of components that we get. We had to prioritize and do a phased approach, so we'll talk about how we approach that. And then, we talked about integrating all of this into your own process, and so we'll touch on that as well, make sure that's included at your engineering process and development process. And then finally, the other two pieces are really defining and updating the process itself, because as you go through this a couple times, you're going to notice that there's feedback from your teams internally, but also from your suppliers on how to kind of improve the process and use that as you roll out to your next phases of suppliers. So where do we start, right? So at Dell, what we did was we started with our own internal STL controls, right, that we talked about earlier. We actually used those and figured out which ones make sense to apply to our suppliers. And we looked at all the technology layers, the hardware, firmware, cloud, and software. We used that as that starting point. My clicker's not working all the time. Yep. As a starting point to build the supplier STL requirements that we're going to give to our suppliers. And this would be really part of the overall supplier security requirements, right? Like Richard mentioned earlier, there's other aspects we're not covering today, infrastructure, security, physical security, and things like that. It'll be a combined supplier's requirement, but STL is the piece that, that we worked on from an engineering point of view. The other thing that we would do here and we've done is include future-looking requirements. Like if there's emerging threats, new regulations like post-quantum crypto we've added, add those now. Because if you ask anyone in procurement, it's hard to renegotiate contracts with suppliers in the future. So if you're trying to do this now, get as many future-looking requirements you can in now. So then once you do have your requirements, we build those attestation forms. And we actually had two versions of the forms. First, we have a supplier risk attestation questionnaire, which really focuses more on the process STL controls, like do you have security training for your engineers? Do you have security champions? More governance-related controls and questions. And then second, we also have a component attestation form. This is the more technical application form, which comes in with every component, and it lists all the technical controls, like do you do threat modeling, do you do static code analysis, the typical STL controls that we need at a component level. So this is what we use, and since we based a lot of this on industry standards and frameworks, and we use that to build our supplier STL, it inherently, kind of aligned everything to the industry, and it helped suppliers adopt it much easier. And any pushback we got was alleviated, for the fact that, hey, this aligns to NIST and other industry standards. And that was kind of our goal, like I was saying, we wanted something that's universal, that's adoptable. We have thousands of suppliers we need to get this rolled out to. We couldn't have one-off set of requirements for different suppliers. And like we said, it helps with the suppliers also, because then they invest and they see the value in it as well. So we don't want to say, this is where we did spend a lot of time, and a lot of this was led by our procurement team and legal team and security governance teams. We're from engineering, so we really focused as SMEs on the STL controls and figuring out which makes sense, and on the attestation forms for the component, because we're actually going to receive those as we receive components. And so we wanted to make sure those were integrated and made sense for engineering teams. Next, we want to talk about how to roll those requirements out that you've created. So we do that by categorizing and prioritizing these components across the different technology layers. And so we'll walk through how we did this in a tiered approach at the different layers and the criteria we used for each layer. So looking at hardware, hardware has a set of technical criteria that we use to evaluate which components were really higher priority, more critical than others. Things like active or passive, hardware components. Do the hardware components have tamper detection built in? Does it have resiliency or recovery built in? And we had a list of hardware, threats and criteria we used. Similarly for firmware components, we have a list of, aspects of firmware that we use to judge if that component is high risk or critical. Things like, does it have access to the network? Does it have access to the cloud? Firmware is a great place to have persistence for an attacker. So, there's different criteria at the firmware layer we use. Software, this includes all the way up to the cloud. As we all know, software has different angles, right? Depending on where it's running, the context, the privileges, the data it has access to. You can use all those to prioritize, which software components that you get are higher risk versus medium and lower, and start risk ranking them across, all these criteria. There's also criteria that's more common across these. I'm not going to go through all of these here listed, but you can look at technical, but also non-technical. Look at how many products use these components, right? What is the volume you sell of those products? And that's another way to look at and prioritize, your components. Also look at the number of sources you have, different suppliers providing those types of components. And so at the end of the day, it's going to be your risk ranking that you need to do across your risk criteria for all these components, get a single list. And really it's all about what's the impact of the customer if there is an exploit or an exposure, and to your business. The other thing we'll add is, we took an engineering approach, and that's what we're sharing with you, very technical examples. When you work with your procurement teams and legal, they're going to even further refine these lists and prioritize based on their own criteria. So when you do have a scale of thousands of suppliers, you can really narrow them down once you start adding these criteria and risk ranking a lot of these. So now let's talk about how we actually risk rank the components versus the suppliers.
Yeah, so as Mohit said, we want to risk our suppliers. So an early step is to start by mapping your supplier components based on their risk profile, and we can do that on a heat map such as the following. And so let's walk through the actual 4 quadrants here. And in no particular order, we have start with high-risk supplier and low-risk components. In this example here, a paper airplane would be considered a low-risk component. A child, obviously it's a high-risk supplier. So
don't bring your kids to work.
Yeah, but a real example would be, let's say an LED on a power adapter. That would be considered a low-risk component, but built by a small LED manufacturer, right? And we might consider the LED manufacturer a high-risk supplier. Maybe they don't have the resources or the security maturity or the facilities that meet our requirements. And now a high-risk supplier, high-risk component. Obviously a commercial aircraft that carries people would be considered a high-risk component, right? And then if it's built in somebody's garage, right, we would consider that a high-risk supplier as well. So a real-world example, let's say a password vault that carries customer credentials, that would be considered a high-risk component. There's a confidentiality aspect to that, but maybe manufactured or built by a small third-party contractor. Right? Maybe the small third-party contractor doesn't have the tools or facilities to do code analysis or other STL activities, so we would rank them as a high-risk supplier. A lower supplier, high-risk component, and in this case, we can have a sophisticated factory, modern environment, with also a high-risk component. So we would think about them as maybe a lower supplier because they have the resources, they have the STL maturity to make sure that their products are designed correctly, they have the physical security, the protections around their infrastructure, to design to potentially meet your supplier standards. In a real world example, let's take an operating system, high risk component, built by, let's say, Microsoft. And Microsoft is a mature organization. They're very security sensitive. They have the facilities, they have the resources, and the know-how to implement things securely. So we would consider them a low risk supplier. Hardware example, a trusted platform module, or a TPM. It's a security chip that we solder to our boards. That's a high risk component. It does security. It's the root of trust on your platform. But built by, let's say, a trusted computing group or TCG member company, we kind of think about these companies as more mature, like the other examples. So we might put them in a low-risk supplier standpoint. And then a low-risk supplier, low-risk component. Let's take that sophisticated factory and have them building paper airplanes, right? So we would consider the component low risk and then the supplier low risk. Another silly example, just to kind of illustrate the point, the rubber feet on the bottom of our laptop here, we would consider those a low risk component. And then built by, let's say, a large tire company that knows how to deal with rubber, knows how to deal with the product, we would consider those a low risk supplier. Oh, I wasn't ready. So in rolling these out, your supplier SDL, you can start with focusing on the high-risk supplier and high-risk components first, and then this is really where it's going to be probably most impactful for you and your customers. It's likely represents the highest risk, business risk and security risk to you. And additionally, you can add varying levels of SDL maturity to the different risk profiles. SDL maturity levels for high-risk suppliers and high-risk components, they require full SDL, whereas low-risk suppliers or components, they could require maybe meet a secondary requirement or a secondary priority. In order to officially roll out these requirements, they can be integrated into your contracts with suppliers and engineering process, and actually we're going to discuss that next. So we're referring back to our full stack SDL model that Mo had discussed earlier. And then integration starts with the existing internal SDL process. We update that internal SDL process to comprehend the supply chain SDL attestations that were defined per the supplier requirements, such as contracts and stuff. And then the supplier will provide us their SDL attestations per the supplier requirements. And they'll deliver that with their components when they provide that to us. From a risk perspective, these attestations can be aggregated across an organization's suppliers to provide an overall supply chain security posture, perhaps in a component security scorecard. As part of our future goals, we want the supplier to provide the SDL artifacts. And we believe that it's important that the engineering teams evaluate these supplier SDL attestations and the artifacts as you get them from a product development standpoint, and we're going to go into some of that next. So our goal is for suppliers to provide those SDL artifacts, as we talked about, per the supplier requirements when they deliver their components. When a supplier starts sharing their artifacts, we can update our internal SDL processes to include the supplier artifacts into our product's SDL assessments. The SDL artifacts will help manage the overall risk of the solution that we develop. Because now we have the benefit of merging the supplier SDL artifacts and with our internal SDL processes, and this helps us understand where there might be additional risks or threats based on our specific implementation. And this also provides us with the insight to potentially mitigate security weaknesses and vulnerabilities with other aspects of our design. This could be an unmitigated hardware vulnerability, like that we talked about earlier, that could be mitigated at, let's say, a firmware or software layer. So having access to the supplier SDL artifacts provides us with that insight and the opportunity to make our products more secure. So we say sharing is caring. And some organizations, or even some designs or products within an organization, they may be okay with an attestation-based security, but for those who have the SDL artifacts, they can benefit from the reduced risk profile of their products. And you won't get that with an attestation-based SDL approach, because all you can confirm is that the supplier met the requirements. In reality, we understand that some suppliers, they may not share their artifacts, or they may provide some differing levels of SDL artifacts, and that's okay. The model should accommodate that and different levels of artifacts. The more we have, the more we can actually work with it, and the better we can manage the risk of our products. So a few additional things we want to consider as we wrap up here. Regular and periodic supplier risk profile assessments need to be considered to handle when the supplier or the components change their risk profile. Because after the initial onboarding of suppliers with some sets of components, that they deliver, the supplier risk actually can change. And so periodic reviews should include reviewing any changes in the component or the supplier risk. Did it move into a different quadrant? And then how the supplier engagement has been, from internal experience, and any updates that need to be made to their existing contracts and requirements and/or maturity level. Risk reviews can also be triggered when the component attestations are provided by the supplier, and the internal teams consider that the risk profile, for whatever reason, changed for the component, and this might exceed the acceptable risk level, requiring further and more SDL than maybe just an attestation-based SDL.
Yeah, and the other thing you want to consider, click that, is an exception process. This is kind of obvious for any process that you're going to roll out, but for us, we've had examples where suppliers weren't meeting the SDL requirements as they were delivering components, or they had unmitigated risks, or some suppliers, like Richard said, they were redlining contracts. And so we really needed to make sure that since this was a business decision, we had the right owners as part of the process. So we had executives from engineering, product management, who owned the product at the end of the day, and procurement or supply chain teams as well, to actually accept the risk if they wanted to.
So, and automation can help with scaling this across possibly thousands of suppliers and components. Build or purchase tooling like we did at Dell to manage SDL attestations and integration of the SDL artifacts. And then create a supplier access to the tooling so they can actually directly enter their SDL attestations or artifacts. And then similar tooling can help with other aspects, such as procurement onboarding, supplier contracts, SDL requirements, risk assessments, or maybe the A word, audits.
Scary words.
Yep. So that was the core of our presentation. We want to leave you with some key takeaways that could help you with rolling out supplier SDL in your organization. If you're a supplier, you also have your own supply chain. So no matter where you are in the supply chain, hopefully this talk could help you with your supply pain. Sorry, I had to make reference to the title.
The first thing is shifting SDL left. It's a bit of an obvious one, but we touched on it quite a bit. Is shifting SDL to include your suppliers. For us, it can either be attestation-based or artifact-based or a combination of the above. Like we said, for us, shifting left was very important for hardware components, since it takes over 2 years to roll out a hardware component. And if you're not building security up front, and by the time you get the component from the supplier and you try to integrate it and find an issue, it's going to cost a lot more, like we said earlier. So for us, that was our initial motivation to start shifting left, especially where it's not as mature from an SDL perspective across the whole industry, which was the hardware and then some of the firmware layer. I'm not going to bring up the R word again. Definitely not.
The word of which
that.
we do not speak.
Yes.
So you want to take a risk-based approach, right? The way to scale this is that risk-based approach when applying this across all your suppliers and your technology stack. Some difficult business decisions may need to be made with the suppliers that don't comply. This could include cost impacts, or maybe looking for a different supplier, or you might just have to accept a risk if it's acceptable. And one thing that'll help is to standardize your supply chain security. It will also help speed up industry adoption regardless of your supplier size and scale.
Yeah, and then finally, this is going to take time. This is, again, coming from us, practical experience. You need to start as soon as possible if you haven't already. We've only scratched the surface. We could have done this for quite a bit to actually give you all the details. But in the end, you need dedicated resources, actually cross-functional. We had teams built up of procurement, engineering, legal, security governance, that were working together. And one of the key things that we learned that was important was planning all this kind of up ahead, especially when you have so many suppliers, knowing the right criteria, how you're going to select them, what are the requirements, getting all that planned before you actually start reaching out to suppliers, because you also don't want to scare them.
Yeah, well.
And then finally, we want to leave you how you can take this back to your organization. The first step obviously is defining your supplier SDL requirements. Like we said, use what you have internally, like we did. Future-proof them a bit as much as you can with new regulations that are coming or emerging threats, and then create those attestation forms that they will submit to you once they actually comply with the SDL requirements.
And then roll out requirements based on, based on risk. So implement a phased risk-based approach to rolling out these requirements. And that depends on your supplier versus your component risk. And then rank suppliers and components by risk by prioritizing critical hardware, firmware, and software components first, and then phase in the lower risk elements next.
Yep. And then finally, step 3 is the integration step, right, that we talked about, integrating the requirements, the attestation, maybe artifacts when you get there into your engineering process, and also in your procurement process. So you need to look at this integration end to end, from the time supplier onboards, you get components, and you build the product. And so one thing we've also learned at this phase is really talking with your suppliers, discussing with them the importance of this, that it needs to be part of their development process, and it's no longer a nice to have. So that was really our call to action here as well, is to start pushing our suppliers, across the industry. Large organizations have more influence like us, and more pull, so we can help start shifting and getting industry to shift left or lefter, to reduce your supply pains.
Yeah.
See,
Right.
I got you back.
Yep, and hopefully, part of our push for the industry is also going to help the smaller companies that don't have as much pull.
Yep.
So.
And that's it. Thank you.
Yep.
Thanks for joining us
That's
today.
our talk. Thank you, guys.
Any questions?
Thank you for coming. Hope you enjoyed it.